in the year of our Lord 1263, in a small stone cottage nestled against the monastery walls of northern England, there lived an herbalist named Aldwin, 47 years old, with weathered hands and silver-streaked auburn hair. For 3 decades, he had tended his garden of healing plants, and tonight we will follow him through an ordinary autumn evening as dusk settles soft as wool across the monastery grounds. Good evening and welcome. I am honored you are here. Tonight we journey to a humble garden where Aldwin moves through his daily tasks with the kind of steady grace that soothes the restless mind. Settle yourself comfortably. Let this story be a soft place to rest. Aldwin stood at the edge of his garden plot, where the last light of afternoon was fading into something gentler and more forgiving. The air held that particular coolness of autumn, not bitter, but fresh with the scent of damp earth and the fading green of plants beginning their long sleep. His weathered hands, stained with the natural dyes of a lifetime's work, moved slowly along the stone border he had built years ago, checking that each plant was settled and secure for the coming cold. The work had no urgency. There was nowhere to be, no deadline pressing at him. The monastery bells had rung for vespers some hours before, and now the world had entered that peaceful hour between day and night when time seemed to move according to its own unhurried rhythm. Around him, the garden exhaled, releasing the warmth it had gathered through the day, preparing for the cooler hours ahead. Aldwin breathed in deeply, feeling the familiar comfort of this transition, this gentle turning point that he had witnessed countless times across his 4 decades. His silver-streaked auburn hair caught the last amber light as he bent to inspect a cluster of chamomile plants. The flowers had already begun to fade, their pale yellow faces dropping gently to the ground. He would need to harvest what remained before the hard frost came. But not tonight. Tonight was for observation, for noticing which plants had thrived and which had struggled, for allowing his hands to remember the texture of each leaf and stem. He hummed a low plain chant melody as he worked, the same melody he hummed in the garden every autumn, a habit so old that the season and the music had become inseparable in his mind. The stone cottage behind him glowed with the soft warmth of the fire he had kindled that morning. Through the small window, he could see the flicker of candlelight, but he felt no pull to go inside just yet. His observant nature had taught him long ago that the garden revealed different secrets depending on when you visited it. The evening garden spoke in whispers and subtle shifts of color, the way the light softened the harsh edges of the stone walls, how the shadows beneath the herb beds grew deeper and more peaceful, how the flowers seemed to fold into themselves like hands in prayer. The path beneath his feet was familiar, worn smooth by thousands of careful steps over the years. His weathered hands knew the way without needing to look, knew which herbs grew in which bed, knew the particular dry whisper of lavender stems and the cool smoothness of sage leaves. He moved along the path with a patience that seemed to have no end, pausing occasionally to touch a plant or simply to stand and listen to the evening sounds. The distant call of a rook settling into the monastery eaves, the soft stirring of wind through the bare branches of the apple tree, the subtle whisper of his own breathing. A deep contentment had settled into Aldwin over the years, Not a loud or dramatic feeling, but something quiet and foundational, like the earth itself beneath the garden beds. He felt it now as he stood among his plants, watching the last color drain from the sky. This contentment was not the sort that required explanation or justification. It simply was. It was rooted in decades of mornings beginning the same way, of hands learning the same tasks, of returning always to this place that held his days like a cupped palm holding water. The shadows were growing longer now. Soon the stars would begin to emerge, those distant points of light that had guided gardeners and monks and ordinary people for all the centuries that had passed before Aldwin was born and would continue long after he was gone. He straightened his back slowly, feeling the familiar pull of muscles that had worked steadily all their lives, and he turned toward the small garden shed where he kept his tools. The shed was barely larger than a closet, built of stone from the same quarry that had provided material for the monastery wall. Inside, everything had its place. The tools hung from wooden pegs, spades and forks and trowels, each worn smooth by use, each one as familiar to his hands as his own fingers. He set down the small bundle of dried yarrow he had been carrying, placing it on the narrow shelf where he kept the herbs he was preparing for the winter stores. The scent rose up to meet him, sharp and clean and medicinal, a smell that meant warmth and healing, and the promise that the cold months ahead would bring with them their own quiet work. His hands moved without conscious thought now, settling tools into their places, straightening the bundles of dried herbs that hung from the rafters. Above his head, strings of healing plants created their own private garden: yarrow and feverfew, mugwort and St. John's wort, chamomile and mint, all hanging upside down in neat bundles, all slowly releasing their beneficial properties into the cool air. The scent in the shed was layered and complex: earth and green growing things, the faintly sweet smell of hay, the sharper notes of the herbs drying overhead. By the time Aldwin stepped back outside, the sky had deepened to a blue that was almost purple. The first stars were becoming visible, small points of silver light that seemed impossibly far away, yet somehow intimate, as if they were watching over the garden and all the work that happened here. He closed the shed door gently, never with force or haste, and made his way back along the familiar path toward his cottage. The walk across the garden took time. There was no reason to hurry. His feet knew every stone, every place where the path dipped slightly or rose a little, every corner where the herbs brushed close enough to touch his legs as he passed. He paused once to look back at the garden he had just left, taking in the sight of it in the gathering darkness. The plants were settling in for the night, becoming indistinct shapes and shadows, but they were there. They were growing. They were preparing for what would come next, just as they always did, just as they would continue to do long after he had tended his last crop and passed his knowledge to someone younger. The cottage door opened with the soft creak of wood that had learned to move with the seasons, swelling slightly in damp weather, settling in dry. Aldwin stepped across the threshold into warmth that embraced him like a familiar hand. The fire he had tended that morning was still glowing, flames reduced now to a steady rhythm of amber and deep red, the wood settling into coals that would hold heat through the night. His weathered hands reached for the poker without conscious thought, stirring the fire just enough to encourage the flames to brighten slightly. The movement released a cascade of sparks that rose like tiny stars ascending toward the chimney. The scent of applewood smoke curled through the small room, warm and comforting, mixing with the lingering fragrance of the herbs that hung in bundles throughout the cottage. This was the smell of his life, the smell that meant home more surely than any word could express. The cottage was modest but complete. A narrow bed with a wool blanket occupied one corner, its simple frame built by Aldwin's own hands decades ago. A wooden table, worn smooth by years of work, sat near the window where the morning light would find it first. Shelves lined the walls, some holding books bound in leather, their pages filled with careful notes about which plants grew best in which conditions, which remedies worked for which ailments. Other shelves held vessels of glass and ceramic, containers filled with oils and powders and dried preparations, each labeled with a neat script in Aldwin's careful hand. He moved to the small window and looked out toward the monastery, where lights were beginning to glow in the stone buildings. Somewhere in those rooms, other men were settling into evening prayer, their voices soon rising in the chanting that would mark the passing of the day. Aldwin could not always hear the words from his cottage, but he could hear the sound, that distant, melodic hum that seemed to vibrate through the very stones of the monastery walls and into the earth beneath. It was another kind of heartbeat, another rhythm that marked time passing, marking the way hours moved forward into night. His silver-streaked auburn hair caught the firelight as he turned from the window. He moved across the cottage toward a shelf where a small ceramic pot sat waiting. Inside was the barley broth he had prepared the day before, a simple mixture of grain and water and the faintest trace of herbs, nothing elaborate, nothing that required his full attention. He placed the pot near the fire's edge, where the heat would gradually warm the contents without rushing them. Everything in his cottage moved at a measured pace. Everything had time to become what it needed to become. While the broth warmed, Aldwin settled into his chair. A seat carved from wood that had come from a tree felled near the monastery more than 20 years ago. The chair had shaped itself to his body over countless evenings, and his body had shaped itself to the chair. He reached for one of the books on the nearby shelf, a volume whose pages he had read so many times that he could have recited passages from memory. But reading it again was not about discovering new information. It was about the familiar comfort of the words, about the feeling of continuity that came from returning always to the same text, the same ideas, the same careful observations about the plants that had defined his life. The book fell open naturally to a page he had marked long ago with a feather. On it was written an account of how to prepare feverfew for the treatment of headaches, a remedy he had refined and improved over his decades of practice. The handwriting was his own, but it seemed to belong to a younger man, someone he could barely remember being. Yet the knowledge was the same. The hands that had written those words were the same hands that tended the garden now, though they bore more lines, more scars, more evidence of the years that had passed. He hummed his plain chant melody again as he read, that same low, wordless melody that seemed to emerge from somewhere deep in his chest, something that needed no particular occasion or reason. The tune accompanied his work, his rest, his ordinary movements through the cottage and the garden. It was so much a part of him that he scarcely noticed when he was doing it. But the monks who occasionally came to him for remedies said they could identify him from the sound alone, and could hear him humming from several paces away as he moved among the plants. The broth was ready now. Aldwin set the book aside carefully, marking his place with the feather once more, and moved to the fire. He lifted the small pot with steady hands, these hands that had learned not to shake, that had learned to move with the deliberate care of someone who had spent a lifetime working with delicate plants and precise measurements. He poured the warm broth into a wooden bowl, watching the steam rise in gentle wisps that carried the faint scent of barley and the lingering memory of summer herbs. He carried the bowl back to his chair and settled himself once more, cradling the bowl in his weathered hands. The warmth of it was pleasant against his palms, not hot enough to cause discomfort, but warm enough to bring a feeling of coziness, of being held by something gentle and nourishing. He drank slowly, pausing between small sips to simply sit and breathe and exist in the quiet of his cottage. There was no need to hurry. The night was long. The fire would continue to burn. The herbs overhead would continue their slow transformation into healing medicines. Outside, beyond the walls of the cottage, the evening had fully surrendered to night. But inside, all was light and warmth, and the comfortable knowledge that everything was exactly as it should be. Aldwin's observant nature allowed him to notice small details that others might have missed. The particular way the firelight caught on the rim of his bowl, the subtle shift in the sound of wind outside as it changed direction, the faint crackle of the fire as it settled deeper into its bed of coals. These small observations were not distractions from peace. They were peace itself, made visible and audible and tangible. When the broth was finished, he set the bowl aside on the table beside his chair. His deep contentment, that foundational quietness that had become the baseline of his existence, settled around him more fully now. The long day of work in the garden, the observing and the noticing and the gentle tending of plants, had left him pleasantly tired. His muscles, which had worked steadily and without complaint for 4 decades, were ready now for the rest that night would bring. He rose from his chair with the careful movements of someone who has learned that rushing creates unnecessary strain. His hands reached for the candle that sat on a small shelf near his bed, and he lit it from the fire using a splint of kindling. The candle's light was softer than the fire, more intimate, creating a smaller circle of illumination in the darkness of the cottage. He hummed his plain chant melody once more as he prepared himself for sleep, removing his outer tunic, folding it carefully, and placing it on the wooden chest at the foot of his bed. The wool blanket welcomed him like something alive, like something that had been waiting all day for this moment of reunion. He settled himself against the pillow, stuffed with dried herbs whose scent had long since faded to something barely perceptible but infinitely comforting, and pulled the blanket up to his chest. The bed held the warmth of his body from previous nights, remembering him, welcoming him home the way the garden had welcomed him home, the way the cottage itself seemed to embrace all who entered seeking shelter and peace. In the darkness, with only the candle's gentle glow and the distant warmth of the fire beyond the cottage wall, Aldwin lay quietly and let his mind settle like a feather descending through still air. His breathing began to slow, to deepen, to match the rhythm of the cottage itself, the slow breathing of a place at rest, of a space that had witnessed decades of quiet evenings just like this one, and would witness many more. The monastery bells in the distance sounded the hour, a single, clear note that seemed to float through the darkness and into his small room. The sound was comforting rather than startling, a reminder that time continued its unhurried passage, that the world beyond his window was still turning, still moving forward through its ancient cycles. But here, in his cottage, in his bed, beneath his familiar blanket, Aldwin existed in a space outside of time, a space where the day's work had been completed, where the night stretched ahead with nothing demanding his attention, nothing requiring anything of him but to rest and to breathe and to allow sleep to come. His weathered hands lay on top of the blanket, their familiar shapes barely visible in the candlelight. These hands had planted thousands of seeds, had pulled countless weeds, and had prepared countless remedies. These hands knew their work completely, utterly. And now they rested, folded loosely over the wool, waiting for tomorrow's work, but content to simply be still for now. The candle's flame flickered gently, casting slow-moving shadows across the ceiling. The fire in the other room continued its quiet work, transforming wood into warmth, into light, into the basic comfort that allowed life to continue through the cold months. Outside, the stars continued their eternal turning, following paths they had followed since long before Aldwin was born and would follow long after he was gone. And in his cottage, in his bed, with his familiar blanket and his pillow of faded herbs, Aldwin closed his eyes and let the night settle gently around him like a final, peaceful sigh. The night deepened around the cottage, and Aldwin's breathing had settled into the slow, even rhythm of deep sleep. Outside, clouds had begun to gather, not the heavy, threatening kind that brought storms, but the soft, gradual clouds of autumn that would bring rain by morning. The air itself seemed to pause, holding its breath before the weather shifted. In the monastery beyond the cottage walls, the monks had completed their evening offices and retreated to their cells. The torches that lit the cloisters had been extinguished one by one, leaving only the faint glow of candles behind narrow windows. The world had grown quieter, the way the world grew quiet only in the deep hours before dawn, when most living things had surrendered to sleep, and the earth itself seemed to rest. But sleep does not mean stillness. Even as Aldwin rested, his garden continued its own kind of work. The plants he had tended that afternoon were still absorbing the cool night air, still drawing nutrients from the soil, still growing in that imperceptible way that plants grow, so slowly that no human eye watching would notice, yet absolutely steadily, without pause. The chamomile was still preparing to fade. The yarrow was still strengthening its roots against the coming cold. The herbs hanging in the cottage shed were still releasing their essential properties into the air. By the time the first pale light of dawn began to touch the eastern horizon, Aldwin was stirring. His eyes did not open suddenly, the way some people wake. Instead, they opened gradually, becoming aware first of the dim shapes in his cottage, then of the quality of light that meant morning was approaching. His weathered hand stretched slightly beneath the blanket, feeling the familiar pull of muscles that had worked a lifetime and were now, in the deep hours of sleep, beginning to prepare themselves for another day of work. He did not rise immediately. This was part of his ritual, this quiet time lying in bed while the world was still mostly asleep, while the line between night and day was still blurred and indefinite. His observant nature allowed him to notice the gradual lightening of the darkness, the way the shadows on the ceiling slowly became less distinct, the faint sound of birds beginning to wake in the monastery gardens. This time of waiting, of transition, was as important to him as the work itself. It was a bridge between the world of sleep and the world of waking, a gentle crossing that his body and mind had learned over decades to value rather than to rush. When he finally rose, his movements were deliberate and unhurried. His feet found the wooden floor, still cool from the night, and he stood for a moment in the semi-darkness, allowing his body to fully acknowledge that it was awake. The silver-streaked auburn hair that framed his face was slightly disheveled from sleep, but he made no move to arrange it. There would be time for such things later. For now, he was simply being, existing in that quiet moment between sleep and the day's beginning. The fire had burned down to embers during the night, but Aldwin had left kindling nearby, as he did every evening. His weathered hands moved with practiced efficiency, rebuilding the fire gradually, coaxing it back to life. First came the smallest twigs, placed carefully around the embers. Then slightly larger pieces of wood, added one at a time, allowing each to catch and begin to burn before adding the next. He hummed his plain chant melody as he worked, that same low tune that seemed to emerge from somewhere deep within, independent of conscious thought. By the time the flames were rising steadily again, the cottage was noticeably lighter. The window that looked toward the monastery was beginning to show gray rather than black. Aldwin stood for a moment, warming his hands over the fire, feeling the heat begin to penetrate into the joints of his fingers. The deep contentment that was his constant baseline was there, as it always was in the morning, a quiet gratitude for another day granted, another opportunity to tend his garden, another sunrise given to him after a night of rest. He dressed slowly, pulling on the same tunic he had folded the night before, securing it at the waist with a cord of twisted wool. His movements held no impatience. The garden would wait. The plants would not judge him for arriving a moment late. This unhurried beginning to the day was as much a part of his craft as the actual tending of the plants. A mind that rushed could not observe carefully. Hands that hurried could not work with precision. The water for washing came from the small barrel he kept near the door, collected rainwater that was soft and clean and held the faint scent of the sky. He splashed it on his face and hands, feeling the shock of the cold, the gradual adjustment as his skin grew accustomed to the temperature. The water ran off his weathered hands in small rivulets, carrying away the residue of sleep, the dust of the day before, preparing him physically for the work ahead. By the time Aldwin stepped outside, the sky was becoming distinctly lighter. The birds were singing now, not the full chorus of midday, but the softer, more tentative songs of birds beginning their day, testing their voices, preparing themselves for the hours of searching for food and tending to nests, and all the work that keeps the avian world moving forward. The air held that particular freshness of early morning, that crispness that came with autumn, that spoke of the season's relentless advance toward winter. His garden lay before him in the gray light of pre-dawn, looking somehow more beautiful in this uncertain illumination than it did in full daylight. The plants were silvered with dew, each leaf and stem wearing a delicate coating of moisture that caught what little light existed and reflected it back into his eyes. The effect was magical without being unnatural, simply the ordinary miracle of how water and light interact, something that happened every morning, and yet never failed to possess a kind of quiet wonder. Aldwin stepped onto the familiar path, his feet finding their way without needing to look. The dew soaked into the leather of his simple shoes, but he did not mind. Wet feet were a part of autumn gardening, as much a part of the season as the cooling air and the fading light. His observant nature took in details. The way the dew was heavier on the north-facing beds where the morning sun would not reach for another hour. The particular geometry of water droplets on the spider webs that stretched between herb plants. The subtle changes in color of the leaves as they continued their slow shift toward dormancy. He moved to the chamomile bed first, the one he had checked the evening before. In the gray light of dawn, the pale flowers looked almost luminous, their fading yellow taking on a quality of gentle radiance. He knelt beside the bed, his weathered hands reaching out to touch the plants with the gentleness of someone greeting old friends. The leaves were cool and slightly damp, but already there was warmth beneath the surface. The internal warmth of the plant still growing, still living, still performing its miraculous transformation of soil and water and sunlight into the substances that could heal human ailments. The work of harvesting the remaining flowers would come later, perhaps that afternoon when the sun had warmed the plants and dried the dew. For now, Aldwin simply knelt and observed. This was part of his method, this quiet witnessing of what the plants were doing, this patient attention that allowed him to understand not just what needed to be done, but when it should be done and how it should be done. Many people who came to him seeking remedies thought his knowledge came from books or from some innate talent. But truly it came from this, from countless mornings spent kneeling beside plants, simply paying attention. The monastery bells rang out the hour, a single clear note that seemed to carry across the cool morning air with particular clarity. The sound marked the beginning of the monk's day, the first of the offices that would structure their hours from now until nightfall. Aldwin rose slowly from the chamomile bed, feeling the familiar slight stiffness in his knees that came from kneeling on cold ground, and made his way toward the other beds that comprised his garden. The mint was thriving still, its green leaves holding their color better than many other plants. The lavender, which had given up its flowers months ago, was preparing itself for winter, drawing its life force down into the roots where it would wait safely through the cold months. The sage was sturdy and unchanging, as sage always was, that most dependable of herbs. The fever showed signs of struggle. A few of its leaves had yellowed and would need to be removed, but overall the plant was holding its own, preparing to withdraw but not yet ready to surrender. Aldwin moved from bed to bed with the meditation of someone performing a ritual that had shaped decades of his life. His hands touched each plant, assessed its condition, and noticed what had changed since the day before. This work required no tools, no complex knowledge, no sophisticated understanding. It required only attention, the kind of attention that his observant nature had cultivated into something approaching an art form. By the time the sun had actually risen, the moment when its upper edge appeared above the distant trees and the sky shifted from gray to gold and amber, Aldwin had completed his morning survey of the entire garden. He knew which plants needed harvesting soon, which ones could wait another week or two, which ones showed signs of disease or stress that would need to be addressed. He knew all of this because he had been paying attention, because he had tended this garden not as a collection of separate tasks, but as a unified whole, a living system that changed daily and required constant, gentle observation. He stood at the center of his garden plot now, his weathered hands folded loosely in front of him, his silver-streaked auburn hair catching the first real light of the new day. The sun was still low enough to cast long shadows across the beds, creating patterns of light and dark that would shift and change as the morning progressed. There was warmth in the sunlight now, not the intense heat of summer, but the gentler, more precious warmth of autumn sun, something to be appreciated and savored because it would not last. This moment, standing in his garden as the day was beginning, surrounded by the plants that had become as familiar to him as his own hands, filled with the quiet satisfaction of knowing that everything was progressing as it should. This moment was the heart of his existence. All the years of work, all the decades of tending and observing and learning had led to this, the ability to stand in a garden on an autumn morning and feel completely, utterly at peace. He hummed his plain chant melody again, that constant companion melody that had marked his days for so long that he could not remember when he had not been humming it. The melody rose into the cool morning air, mingling with the sounds of the monastery in the distance, with the calls of the birds that were now fully awake and engaged in their own morning work, with the subtle whisper of the breeze moving through the plants. A sound from the direction of the monastery caught his attention, footsteps on the stone path that led from the main buildings toward the guest quarters. Aldwin recognized them immediately, without needing to look. Brother Cuthbert, the oldest of the monks, who walked with a particular rhythm, his left foot falling slightly before his right, a gait shaped by an old injury sustained decades ago. The brother was making his morning circuit, as he did most days, his constitutional walk before the day's duties began in earnest. Aldwin did not move to greet him. There was no need. Brother Cuthbert would pass by the garden, would see Aldwin standing there among his plants, and would offer a quiet nod of acknowledgement. They had developed, over the years, a kind of friendship that required very few words. The brother came to Aldwin occasionally with ailments, a persistent cough, a stiffness in the joints, the small pains that accumulated with age, and Aldwin would prepare remedies, always with the same careful attention he gave to everything else. Sure enough, as Aldwin turned back to his observation of the plants, he caught sight of Brother Cuthbert's dark-robed form moving along the distant path. The monk paused for a moment as he drew near, looking out over the garden with the appreciation of someone who understood that what Aldwin did was important work, necessary work, work that contributed to the health and well-being of the entire monastery community. The brother's aged face, weathered by decades of sun and wind and prayer, creased into a gentle smile. He raised one hand in a gesture of greeting, and Aldwin raised his own weathered hand in return. No words were exchanged. There was no need for them. In that moment of mutual acknowledgement, decades of quiet understanding passed between them. Understanding of what it meant to devote a life to careful work, to patient attention, to the slow accumulation of knowledge earned through years of practice and observation. Brother Cuthbert continued on his way, his footsteps gradually fading as he moved deeper into the monastery grounds. Aldwin turned back to his garden, and the morning continued its gentle unfolding. The sun climbed higher, the shadows shortened, the dew gradually evaporated from the plants, and the world moved forward into the fullness of day. But for a few moments, Aldwin remained still, feeling the deep contentment that was the foundation of his existence settle around him like something tangible, something he could almost reach out and touch. The morning progressed with the gradual inevitability of autumn unfolding. By the time the sun had climbed to the height where its warmth could truly be felt, Aldwin had moved into the practical work of the day. He had retrieved his tools from the small shed, a wooden basket, a pair of shears with handles worn smooth by decades of use, and a cloth for collecting the plants he would harvest. The chamomile flowers were his first task. In the strengthening daylight and warmth, the dew had completely evaporated, and the plants had begun to open more fully to the day. His weathered hands moved with a precision that came from long practice, selecting only the flowers that had reached their peak, not those still in tight bud, not those already beginning to fade, but only those in the exact moment of their fullest expression. This selectivity was part of his craft. Lesser herbalists might have harvested everything at once, but Aldwin understood that timing mattered, that the moment of peak vitality in a plant was different for each individual flower. He hummed his plain chant melody as he worked, the low notes seeming to match the rhythm of his movements. Gather, place gently in the basket, move to the next flower. Gather, place gently, move forward. The work had no haste to it, no sense of urgency. The garden would provide what it was ready to provide. Aldwin's role was simply to be present, to observe carefully, and to harvest with respect for what the plants had grown. As he worked, his observant nature caught sight of a small irregularity in one of the plants, a slight discoloration on a few of the leaves, the kind of subtle sign that might escape someone less attentive. He set down his basket and knelt beside the plant, examining it more closely. The leaves showed a faint brownish tint along their edges, barely perceptible unless one was looking for it. This was the beginning of a fungal issue, something that could spread to other plants if left unchecked, but something that could also be addressed now, in this early stage, with proper attention. Aldwin rose and made his way back to his cottage, moving with the careful deliberation of someone who has learned that rushing creates mistakes. From a shelf near his workspace, he retrieved a small ceramic vessel containing a preparation he had made the previous month, a mixture of herbs and oils that he used for exactly this kind of situation. The scent that rose from the vessel when he opened it was strong and medicinal. The sharpness of thyme, the earthiness of comfrey root, the subtle peppery notes of other plants he had combined through years of experimentation. He carried the vessel back to the affected plant, along with a small cloth, Working with the same careful attention he gave to everything, he applied the preparation to the discolored leaves, coating them gently but thoroughly. The work was not difficult, but it required presence, the kind of full attention that meant his mind was not wandering to other tasks, other concerns, but was completely engaged in the single action of treating the plant. When he had finished, he stepped back to observe his work. The leaves still showed their discoloration, but they were now coated with the protective preparation. Over the next few days, if the weather remained dry, the fungal growth would be arrested. If it rained, he would need to reapply the treatment. This was the ongoing conversation between a gardener and the plants in his care. Not a single action that solved problems permanently, but a constant, gentle negotiation between human intention and natural processes. The morning had progressed to the point where the sun was creating sharp shadows and genuine warmth. Aldwin returned to his harvesting, completing the work on the chamomile flowers. By the time he had finished, his basket held what looked like a small cloud of pale yellow blooms, each one selected with care, each one at its peak of vitality. The work had taken him nearly 2 hours, though it had not felt like work in the sense of something burdensome. It had felt like the continuation of a conversation that had been ongoing for decades. He carried the basket back to his cottage and set it in the drying room, a small space attached to the main building where air circulated freely and where the herbs could slowly release their moisture. The chamomile flowers would need to be spread out on cloth to dry evenly, and this would be part of the afternoon's work. For now, Aldwin left them and turned his attention to other tasks that the garden required. The noon hour came and went, marked by the monastery bells that seemed to carry across the air with particular clarity on this autumn day. Aldwin paused in his work to prepare a simple meal: bread that had been baked 2 days before, cheese that he had obtained from the monastery's dairy in exchange for remedies he had provided, and an apple from the small tree that grew near his cottage. He ate slowly, sitting on a low bench near his garden, taking in the sight of the plants and the monastery buildings beyond them. This was a moment of quiet observation of a different kind. As he ate, his eyes moved across his garden, assessing not the individual plants but the overall picture. The way the beds were organized, the subtle patterns created by the different heights and colors of the various plants, the particular geometry of light and shadow that the late morning sun created. An untrained eye would have seen only a collection of herbs. But Aldwin's observant nature saw a unified whole, a living system that had taken decades to establish and would continue to evolve for decades more, long after he had tended his last crop. The afternoon brought new work. The fever required attention. Those yellowing leaves needed to be carefully removed so that the plant's energy could be directed toward the parts that were still healthy and vigorous. This was delicate work, requiring both gentleness and decisiveness. Each leaf that had begun to fail needed to be identified and removed, but the removal itself had to be done in a way that did not shock or damage the plant. Aldwin worked through the afternoon with a focus that was complete but never tense. His hands, weathered and scarred from decades of work, moved with a sureness that came from having performed these tasks countless times. But each time was also new, because each plant was slightly different. Each day brought different conditions of light and temperature and moisture. Each season presented its own particular challenges and opportunities. As the afternoon progressed, the quality of light began to shift again. The sun, which had climbed so high at midday, began its descent toward the western horizon. The shadows lengthened, the warmth became gentler, and the air took on that particular quality that meant evening was approaching. This shift from afternoon to evening was always marked by a subtle change in Aldwin's pace. Not a slowing down exactly, but a gradual transition toward completion, toward closure, toward preparation for the rest that night would bring. He completed the work on the feverfew and made his way to the drying room to check on the chamomile flowers he had harvested that morning. The blooms were already beginning to release their moisture, and the small room was filled with their delicate, slightly apple-like scent. He turned them carefully, spreading them a bit more evenly across the cloth, ensuring that air could circulate freely around all of them. This would help them dry more uniformly, would preserve more of their healing properties, and would result in a better final product. The lavender bundles that had been hanging in the drying room for the past several weeks were nearly ready. Their scent had become slightly more concentrated, and when Aldwin pressed one gently between his weathered fingers, it crumbled easily into small, aromatic fragments. He would need to strip these flowers from their stems soon, would store them in sealed vessels where they could continue to age and develop their properties over the coming months. Some of these flowers would eventually become part of remedies. Others would be used simply for their fragrance, for the way their scent could soothe and calm an anxious mind. As he worked through these tasks, his mind maintained a kind of parallel awareness. While his hands were occupied with the practical work of turning flowers and checking preparations, his thoughts drifted in that peaceful, undirected way that came from doing work he had perfected over decades. He thought about Brother Cuthbert, about the monk's greeting that morning, about the years of quiet friendship that had developed between them without either man really noticing when it had begun. He thought about the monastery beyond his garden, about the hundreds of people who had come to him seeking remedies over the years, about the small role his work played in a much larger community. This kind of thinking was not troubled or complicated. It was simply the natural flow of a mind that was content, that had made peace with its place in the world, that had learned to find satisfaction in small things. The deep contentment that was Aldwin's emotional baseline had not fluctuated in all the decades since it had settled into him. It was as constant as the earth beneath the garden, as reliable as the seasons themselves. By the time the sun had reached the point where it was clearly descending toward the horizon, that particular angle of light that meant there was perhaps 2 hours of working daylight remaining, Aldwin had completed most of the afternoon's tasks. He made his way back to his cottage, carrying with him a small bundle of sage that he had cut for drying. The leaves were strong and green still, would maintain their potency for many months after they had dried, and would be useful in treating a variety of ailments that the monastery community might experience as the cold months approached. He spread the sage on clean cloth to begin the drying process, humming his plainchant melody as he worked. The cottage was beginning to cool now, as the day's warmth gradually dissipated, but it would remain pleasant for several more hours. The fire from that morning had burned down to embers again, and Aldwin made no move to rebuild it. There was no need for heat yet. The chill that came with evening would not arrive for hours still. He settled into his chair to wait for the evening, and his observant nature took in the changing quality of light in the cottage. The windows that looked toward the monastery were beginning to show that particular amber color that came in the hour before sunset. The shadows were lengthening, becoming more dramatic. The whole cottage seemed to be slowly transforming from the bright, practical space of daytime into something softer, something that seemed to invite rest and contemplation. A sound from outside caught his attention, the calls of crows gathering in the trees near the monastery, their evening congregation before they settled for the night. The sound was harsh compared to the gentle sounds of the morning birds, but it was not alarming. It was simply part of the rhythm of the day, part of the way the natural world marked time, marked the turning of the hours and the seasons. Aldwin listened to the crows with the same attention he gave to everything else, finding in their sound a kind of rough beauty, a reminder that not everything in nature needed to be soft to be worthy of respect. As the light continued to fade, Aldwin rose and began preparing for evening in the same unhurried way he did everything else. He would eat another simple meal soon, this time perhaps some of the broth he had prepared earlier in the week, warmed by the fire he would kindle when the light had faded enough to require it. He would read for a time, or simply sit and allow his mind to rest from the day's work. And eventually, as the night deepened, he would make his way to his bed and sink into the sleep that his body and mind had earned through a full day of careful, attentive work. But all of that was still ahead. For now, in this transitional time between afternoon and evening, between day and night, Aldwin simply stood in his cottage and looked out toward the monastery as its lights began to glow in the gathering darkness. He was exactly where he needed to be. He was exactly who he needed to be. And the day, like all the days before it, was moving toward its gentle close. The fire had been kindled again as the last golden light faded from the sky. Aldwin had coaxed the embers back to life with the same patient attention he gave to everything, building the flames gradually, watching as each piece of wood caught and began to burn before adding the next. Now the cottage was warm again, filled with the comfort of heat and light as the darkness outside grew deeper. The broth he had mentioned warming was simmering near the fire's edge, sending up gentle wisps of steam that carried the faint scent of herbs and barley. The preparation was simple, nothing elaborate, nothing that required his full attention while it cooked. He had tended this particular batch for 3 days now, adding herbs to the base stock, allowing the flavors to deepen and meld. This broth was meant not just for nourishment, but for healing, and Aldwin understood that proper preparation required time and care in equal measure. His weathered hands were occupied with the evening's practical work. He had begun the process of stripping the lavender flowers from their dried stems, a task that required neither great strength nor complex skill, but rather a kind of meditative attention. The flowers released easily from the stems now that they had dried completely, and his fingers moved with a rhythm that had become almost musical over the decades. Strip, gather, place in the bowl. Strip, gather, place. The motion was repetitive, but the repetition itself was soothing, a rhythm that seemed to calm both body and mind. As he worked, his eyes occasionally drifted to the window that looked out toward the monastery. The buildings were now visible only as darker shapes against the night sky, marked by the scattered lights of candles in windows. Somewhere in those stone buildings, the monks were completing their evening offices, their voices rising in chant for the final time before the day gave way to night. Aldwin could not hear the words at this distance, but he could sometimes catch the faint vibration of sound, that distant hum that seemed to resonate through the very air itself. The lavender flowers accumulated gradually in the ceramic bowl, a growing pile of small, fragrant purple fragments. Each flower released a tiny cloud of scent as it was stripped from its stem, and by the time Aldwin had worked through half of the bundle, the air in the cottage was thick with the herbal perfume. It was a clean, uplifting scent, one that seemed to clear the mind even as it soothed the body. He paused occasionally to simply breathe deeply, allowing the scent to fill his lungs, feeling the subtle shift in his awareness that came from inhaling the essential oils of the plant. This was part of his observant nature as well, this attention to scent, to the way different plants affected the body and mind through their aromas alone. He had learned over decades that preparation mattered, that the way one approached a plant or a remedy could affect its efficacy. A person who harvested plants with haste and irritation might produce less effective medicine than a person who approached the same task with patience and reverence. The plants themselves seemed to respond to the quality of attention directed toward them. By the time Aldwin had completed the stripping of the first bundle of lavender, the evening had deepened into that quiet hour that came after the monastery offices had concluded. The distant sound of bells had faded, and the world had settled into a more profound silence, not the complete absence of sound, but rather the particular quietness that came when most people had withdrawn indoors, and the day's activities had largely ceased. He set aside the first bundle and reached for the second one, and the work continued. His hands moved with the same steady rhythm. His attention remained focused on the simple task, and his mind existed in that peaceful state that came from being completely engaged in work that required neither anxiety nor urgency. This was meditation of a different kind than sitting in silence. It was meditation through action, through the gentle, repetitive engagement of hands and mind in a task that was familiar enough to not require conscious thought, yet engaging enough to prevent the mind from wandering into worry or distraction. The broth was ready now. Aldwin set aside his work with the lavender temporarily and retrieved a wooden bowl from the shelf near the fire. Using a carefully carved wooden spoon, he ladled the warm broth from the pot, watching as the steam rose up to meet his face. The warmth was pleasant against his skin, and the scent that rose with the steam was comforting, the earthiness of barley mingling with the lighter scents of the herbs he had added. He settled into his chair and cradled the bowl between his weathered hands, allowing the warmth to penetrate into his palms. For a long moment, he simply held it there, not drinking, but simply allowing himself to feel the comfort of the warmth, to breathe in the steam, to be present in the moment. When he finally raised the bowl to his lips and took a sip, the warmth spread through his chest, carrying with it the subtle flavors of the herbs and the nourishment of the grain. He drank slowly, pausing between sips to simply sit and exist. Outside, the wind had picked up slightly. Aldwin could hear it moving around the cottage, testing the small gaps around the door and window, moving through the bare branches of the apple tree that stood near his garden. The sound was not threatening. It was simply the sound of the natural world continuing its ancient patterns, the wind moving as it always moved, carrying with it the scent of the coming rain that the morning's clouds had promised. When the broth was finished, Aldwin set the bowl aside and returned to the lavender flowers. The second bundle went more quickly than the first, his hands having found their rhythm, his fingers remembering exactly how much pressure was required to release the flowers from their stems without crushing them. The pile in the ceramic bowl continued to grow, the fragrance in the air continuing to deepen. By the time he had completed the stripping of the lavender, the bowl held what looked like a small cloud of the tiny purple flowers. Tomorrow or the next day, when he had the time, he would transfer these into sealed ceramic vessels where they could be stored for months or even years, their potency remaining strong as long as they were kept away from light and dampness. Some would be used in remedies. Others would be given to the monastery as gifts, or sold to the few people in the nearby village who could afford such luxuries. The work completed, Aldwin cleaned up carefully, returning the stems to a separate pile. They would eventually be composted back into the garden beds, returning their nutrients to the soil, and setting the sealed bowl of lavender flowers aside in a safe place where it would not be disturbed. This attention to order, to putting things in their proper places, was as much a part of his craft as the actual preparation of the remedies. A mind that was organized in its external environment could function more clearly in all things. He hummed his plain chant melody as he cleaned, the low notes seeming particularly resonant in the quiet of the cottage, particularly clear in the way they echoed slightly off the stone walls. The melody had been with him for so long that he could no more imagine his life without it than he could imagine his life without his hands or his eyes. It was woven into the fabric of his existence, marking his days as surely as the monastery bells marked the passage of hours. The fire had burned down somewhat while he worked, and now Aldwin fed it fresh wood, coaxing the flames back to a more robust level. The warmth would be pleasant through the evening hours, and the light would be useful for the work he intended to do before sleep claimed him. He had several entries to make in his record books, careful notes about which plants had thrived this year, which ones had shown signs of struggle, what preparations had proven most effective for various ailments that the monastery community had presented to him. He settled into his chair with one of the leather-bound volumes and began to write. His handwriting was neat and precise, the result of decades of practice, though his penmanship had slowed somewhat with age. The candle burned steadily beside him, casting its light across the page, and his weathered hand moved slowly across the vellum, recording observations that would be useful to whoever came after him. Whether that was a student he might eventually take on, or simply future generations of herbalists who might someday read his records and benefit from the knowledge he had accumulated. The writing required a different kind of attention than the manual work of the garden. It required his mind to be more fully engaged, to organize his thoughts into words and sentences, to consider how to express complex ideas about plants and their uses in ways that would be clear to someone reading the words long after he had written them. This work filled the evening hours, the gentle scratch of his pen on vellum providing a soft counterpoint to the crackle of the fire and the occasional whisper of the wind outside. When he had completed the entries he had planned for that evening, Aldwin set aside his pen and closed the record book. The fire had burned down again to a comfortable level, warm but not so intense as to make the cottage oppressively hot. The wind outside had settled somewhat, and the world beyond his small cottage seemed to have grown even quieter than before. He rose from his chair and moved to the window, looking out toward the monastery. The lights in the distant buildings had been extinguished now, save for a single candle that burned in what he knew to be the monk's library. Brother Cuthbert sometimes spent his evenings there, reading or simply sitting in quiet contemplation. The thought of the old monk sitting in the candle-lit room brought to Aldwin's mind a sense of connection, not in any complicated way, but simply the awareness that even though they lived separate lives, even though their daily work was quite different, they were both engaged in variations of the same fundamental activity: the pursuit of knowledge, the attention to detail, the commitment to a kind of work that required patience and care. The deep contentment that was Aldwin's baseline emotional state settled around him more fully as evening deepened. He had completed a full day of work. His hands had been busy in meaningful ways. His mind had been engaged. The plants had received the care they needed. The monastery community would benefit from the remedies he was preparing. And now the evening was arriving to carry him towards sleep and the rest that his body had earned. He prepared for bed in the same unhurried manner he did everything else. The fire was banked carefully, fresh wood added and positioned so that it would burn slowly through the night, providing warmth without creating excessive heat. His outer tunic was folded and set aside. His small candle was lit from the fire and carried to his bedside. The wool blanket welcomed him as it always did, holding the warmth of previous nights, comforting and familiar. He settled beneath it and pulled it up to his chin, feeling the weight of it, the texture of it against his skin. His weathered hands lay folded on the blanket, their familiar shapes barely visible in the candlelight. His silver-streaked auburn hair lay against the pillow that held the faint memory of countless nights of sleep. As he lay there, waiting for sleep to come, his mind drifted in that peaceful, undirected way that came when a body was truly tired from honest work. He thought about the plants in his garden, about the way they were settling in for the cooler months ahead. He thought about the chamomile flowers that were drying in his small room, about the lavender flowers now safely stored, about all the preparations that would eventually emerge from the work he had done and would continue to do. The wind picked up again outside and rain began to fall, that gentle autumn rain that the morning's clouds had promised. The sound of it on the cottage roof was soft and soothing, a rhythm that seemed to match the beating of his own heart, the breathing of his own lungs. The rain would nourish the plants, would help them settle in for dormancy, would prepare the soil for the next year's growth. Aldwin closed his eyes and let the sound of the rain carry him towards sleep. His deep contentment, that foundational peace that had become as much a part of him as his breath, settled more deeply still. Tomorrow would bring new work, new observations, new opportunities to tend the garden and prepare remedies. But that was tomorrow. For now, there was only the darkness, the warmth of his blanket, the sound of rain, and the slow descent into sleep that was already beginning to claim him. The candle burned quietly beside his bed, its flame moving slightly as the air in the cottage shifted. The fire beyond the wall continued its slow work, burning wood into warmth and light. Outside, the rain continued to fall, soaking into the earth, nourishing the plants, washing away the dust of the past day. And in his bed, with his familiar blanket and his pillow of faded herbs, Aldwin drifted deeper into sleep, carried along by the sounds and sensations of the night, moving toward the rest that was as much a part of his life as the work itself. The rain continued through the night, a gentle, steady percussion that seemed to mark the passage of hours in a way that time itself could not quite manage. Aldwin slept deeply, the kind of sleep that comes from a body that has worked honestly and a mind that has found peace in the work. In his dreams, if dreams visited him at all, there were only gardens, endless gardens of growing things, plants swaying in breezes that carried the scent of earth and growing things. When he woke, it was not to any sudden sound or disturbance, but rather to that gradual awareness that comes in the deepest part of night, when sleep is complete but consciousness is beginning to stir at its edges. The rain had softened to a gentle patter, though it had not ceased entirely. The cottage was cool now, the fire having burned down to a few glowing embers, but the wool blanket held warmth enough, and Aldwin lay quietly, listening to the sound of the rain and feeling no urgency to rise. This was another kind of peace, the peace of waking in the deep hours of night and knowing that there was no need to do anything, that the world beyond his cottage was sleeping, that he could simply lie and exist in the darkness without any demand or expectation placed upon him. His weathered hands lay folded on his blanket, and he looked up at the vague shape of the ceiling, barely visible in the darkness. Time moved differently in the deep hours of night. Minutes seemed to stretch and become hours, or hours seemed to compress into moments. Aldwin made no effort to track it, making no attempt to determine whether he had been awake for a few minutes or a considerable time. The awareness simply was, floating in the darkness like a boat on still water, not going anywhere, simply existing. Eventually, though he could not have said when, sleep began to reclaim him again. His consciousness drifted, the awareness of the cottage and the rain gradually becoming less insistent, less real, until only the sensation of warmth and the sound of water remained. He descended again into sleep, deeper this time, carrying with him no dreams that he would remember, only the deep rest that the body requires and cherishes. When morning came again, the rain had ceased, though the air outside was still laden with moisture. Aldwin woke more naturally this time, as the gray light of early dawn began to seep through the window. His body had received the rest it needed, and his mind emerged from sleep with the same clarity and peace that it had possessed when he lay down. There was no grogginess, no disorientation. There was simply the awareness that night had passed and day was beginning again. He lay for a few moments in the quiet of early morning, listening to the world waking around him. The birds were calling, though their voices seemed softer this morning, dampened perhaps by the moisture in the air. From the direction of the monastery came the sound of the bells, marking the hour for the monks to rise and begin their first office of the day. The sound seemed particularly clear this morning, carrying across the wet ground with unusual clarity. Rising was a slower process than usual. The night had been cool, and Aldwin's joints moved with slightly less ease this morning, though there was no pain, only the gentle stiffness that came with age and dampness. He moved with his habitual care, not rushing, allowing his body time to fully awaken, to remember what it was to be upright and engaged in the world rather than resting in sleep. The fire had burned down to almost nothing during the night. The cottage was noticeably cooler than it had been the evening before. Aldwin moved to rebuild the fire, and this task took him more time than usual. His fingers were not quite as nimble in the cold morning air, and he had to warm his weathered hands several times before they regained their full dexterity. But eventually the flames began to rise, and the cottage began to warm, and the familiar comfort of heat and light began to return. By the time the sun had actually risen, the moment when its upper edge appeared above the distant trees, Aldwin was ready to step outside. The world had been transformed by the rain. The earth in his garden was rich and dark with moisture. The plants hung heavy with water droplets that caught the first light of morning and turned it into something miraculous. The air itself smelled different, cleaner somehow, with the dust of the previous day washed away, replaced with the fresh scent of wet earth and growing things. His observant nature drank in the details. The rain had been gentle enough that it had not damaged any of the plants, and the moisture would be welcomed by their roots as the weather grew colder. The path through the garden was dark with water, and his simple leather shoes sank slightly into the softened earth as he moved along it. Everything was quieter this morning. The birds had fewer insects to pursue in the wet conditions, and the world seemed to exist in a state of dampened, muted peace. He moved first to check on the plant that he had treated with his fungal remedy the day before. The preparation had held, the discoloration had not spread, and the plant seemed to be responding well to the treatment. This small success brought with it a quiet sense of satisfaction. The intervention had been necessary and timely. The plant would likely recover fully, would continue to thrive and grow. This was the work, not grand gestures, but small, careful responses to the particular needs of each individual plant. The rest of the garden had weathered the rain well. Some of the plants showed signs of stress. A few leaves here and there had been knocked loose by the heavier drops. A few stems had bent slightly under the weight of accumulated water. But overall the garden had come through the night in good condition. Aldwin's weathered hands moved through the plants, straightening what needed straightening, removing any damaged growth, checking for any new issues that the wet conditions might have created. He found several snails that had emerged in the moisture, creatures that could damage plants if left unchecked. But Aldwin's approach to them was not violent. Instead, he gently gathered them and moved them to a different area of the garden, far from the vulnerable plants, where they could continue their lives without causing harm. This was part of his philosophy, that everything that lived deserved to live, but that their living should not come at the expense of the plants he had committed to tending. By the time he had completed his morning survey of the garden, the sun had climbed high enough to begin drying the excess moisture from the plants and soil. Aldwin moved to his drying room to check on the chamomile flowers he had been processing. The moisture in the air from the night's rain would have affected them slightly, and they would need to be spread out more carefully to allow air circulation to resume properly. As he worked, his mind engaged in the kind of observation that had become second nature to him. The chamomile flowers had absorbed some of the moisture from the air, but not enough to cause any real damage. They would simply need a day or two more of careful drying to reach the optimal state. This kind of adjustment was constant in the work of preparing herbs. The weather changed, the seasons shifted, and the drying process required constant attention and modification based on the particular conditions of each day. The lavender flowers he had stripped and stored were safely sealed in their ceramic vessel, protected from the excess moisture, ready to age in the darkness. The sage he had cut was still in the early stages of drying and would benefit from the slight drying breeze that the morning sun was beginning to create in the drying room. Aldwin's humming of his plain chant melody seemed particularly resonant this morning, echoing off the stone walls of the drying room. The melody had become so much a part of his existence that he barely noticed when he was doing it anymore, but others had noticed over the years. He had been told that they could identify him from the sound alone and could hear him coming from some distance away because of the distinctive low hum that accompanied his work. The morning progressed into midday, and Aldwin turned his attention to other tasks. The soil in his garden beds was rich and moist from the rain, and this was an ideal time to make preparations for the coming winter. He worked through the afternoon, turning soil in the beds that would lie dormant through the cold months, mixing in composted material from the pile where he kept the processed waste from his plants and his work. This work was physically demanding in a way that some of the more delicate plant work was not. It required strength as well as care, required his weathered hands to grip and turn the earth, required his back and shoulders to engage in the movement. But Aldwin approached it with the same unhurried pace he brought to everything else. He was not trying to complete it as quickly as possible. He was trying to complete it as well as possible, and that required time. Brother Cuthbert appeared again in the early afternoon, making his constitutional walk along the path that bordered Aldwin's garden. This time the old monk paused for longer, observing the work that was being done. The heavy, dark soil that Aldwin was turning gleamed in the afternoon light, rich with organic matter, ready to support the growth of next year's plants. "The garden has weathered the rain well," Brother Cuthbert observed, his voice carrying the roughness of great age, but also the clarity of someone whose mind remained sharp and engaged. Aldwin straightened from his work and turned to face the monk. "The rain was gentle," he replied, his voice quiet but clear. "It nourished without harming. The plants are grateful, as am I." The two men stood together for a moment, looking out over the garden. No other words were exchanged. There was no need for them. The understanding between them was deep enough that words could become almost superfluous. They had both spent decades in their respective callings. Both understood what it meant to commit oneself to work that required patience and attention. That understanding was enough. When Brother Cuthbert continued on his walk, Aldwin returned to his work, and the afternoon continued its gradual progression toward evening. The sun climbed higher and then began its descent. The shadows lengthened, and the quality of light shifted from the bright clarity of midday to something softer and more golden. By the time the afternoon had progressed into that transitional hour before evening, Aldwin had completed the soil preparation for most of his garden beds. His weathered hands were dark with earth. His tunic was marked with the dust and moisture of the day's work, but there was a quiet satisfaction in the completion of the task. The beds were ready now for the coming cold months. Whatever plants would survive the winter would do so in soil that had been carefully prepared and enriched. He moved to the well near his cottage and drew water to wash the earth from his hands and face. The water was cold and fresh, and it revived him in that particular way that cold water can, bringing him back into full presence in his body after hours of focused work. As he dried himself on a cloth that hung nearby, he looked back toward his garden. The rain-dampened earth was beginning to dry now. The plants were beginning to recover their normal appearance after the moisture and weight of the night's precipitation. His observant nature took in every detail. The way the late afternoon light caught on the remaining drops of water that clung to leaves, the subtle shift in the color of the plants as they adjusted to the changing light, the particular smell of the earth as it dried, that rich, profound scent that spoke of growing things and natural processes. All of these details were part of what made this work worth doing, what gave meaning to the decades he had devoted to this garden. As the sun continued its descent, Aldwin made his way back to his cottage. The evening would bring its own tasks, the preparation of another simple meal, the tending of the fire, the continued attention to the herbs that were drying in his workshop. But there was no urgency to these tasks, no sense that they needed to be rushed. They would be completed in their own time, at their own pace, with the same care and attention that he brought to everything. The cottage welcomed him as it always did, warm now from the fire that had been burning all day. The scent of the herbs drying in the various rooms was rich and complex, layer upon layer of plant essences mingling in the air. This was the smell of his life's work, the accumulated fragrance of decades of careful attention to growing things. He settled into his chair as the evening deepened, and the rhythm of another day moved toward its close. Tomorrow would bring new work, new observations, new opportunities to tend his garden and continue the practice that had sustained him for so many years. But that was tomorrow. For now, there was only the present moment, the warmth of the fire, the slowly gathering darkness outside, and the deep, foundational peace that had become so much a part of him that he could no longer imagine existing without it. The evening settled in gradually, the way autumn evenings do, without any abrupt transition between day and night, but rather a slow, gentle fading of light and a gradual deepening of shadow. Aldwin prepared his meal with the same unhurried attention he gave to everything, warming the broth that had been simmering for days now, tearing bread into manageable pieces, setting out cheese on a simple wooden plate. The work of preparing food was, in his mind, not separate from the work of tending the garden. It was all part of the same continuum of care, the same commitment to nourishing both body and spirit. As he ate, his eyes moved frequently toward the small window that looked out toward the monastery. The buildings were beginning to glow now with candlelight, windows becoming small points of illumination against the gathering darkness. Somewhere in those stone buildings, the monks were completing their evening offices, their voices rising in chant as they had risen every evening for years beyond counting. Aldwin had never attended these services. His place was in his garden and his cottage, not in the monastery proper. But he heard the distant sound of their singing sometimes, carried on the wind across the space that separated his small dwelling from their larger community. The meal completed, he turned his attention to the work that occupied most of his evenings. The record books awaited, but before he could begin his writing, there were preparations to be made. Several of the bundles of drying herbs needed to be attended to, spread more carefully to ensure even drying, checked for any signs of mold or damage that the night's moisture might have encouraged. In the drying room attached to his cottage, Aldwin moved methodically through the various bundles and arrangements of plants. His weathered hands were gentle as they handled the delicate dried material, his observant nature checking each bundle for signs of problems. The yarrow was drying beautifully, its feathery flowers retaining their color and fragrance. The mugwort was progressing well, its leaves crisp and ready for storage within a few more days. The St. John's wort showed that particular golden color that indicated the flowers had reached their peak potency. He hummed his plain chant melody as he worked, the low notes filling the small space with a vibration that seemed almost to be part of the plants themselves. The melody had become so intertwined with his work that each seemed to enhance the other, the music giving rhythm to the work giving meaning to the music. Around him, the accumulated fragrance of decades of herb drying rose up like a visible presence, layer upon layer of plant essences, creating an atmosphere that was almost medicinal in itself. By the time he had completed the evening's work with the drying herbs, the darkness outside was nearly complete. The monastery bells had rung for the final office of the day, and the world had settled into that deep quietness that came in the hours before sleep. Aldwin secured the drying room carefully, checking that the windows were positioned correctly to allow air circulation while preventing rain or small animals from entering, and returned to the main cottage. The fire had burned down somewhat, and he rebuilt it carefully, creating a steady blaze that would provide warmth and light for the evening's work ahead. The flames rose, casting dancing shadows across the stone walls, and the cottage transformed once again into that comfortable, enclosed space where all the work of his life seemed to converge and consolidate into meaningful purpose. He settled into his chair with his leather-bound record book, the candle positioned carefully beside him to provide adequate light for his writing. The pen felt familiar in his weathered hand. He had held it countless evenings over countless years, marking down observations that might prove useful to future generations of herbalists, documenting the particular conditions of each season, recording which remedies had proven most effective for various complaints. Tonight's entry concerned itself with observations about the rain and its effects on the garden. He wrote carefully about which plants had shown stress, which ones had thrived with the additional moisture, what adjustments he intended to make in response to what he had observed. His handwriting was steady, each letter formed with care, the words flowing across the vellum in neat, organized lines. As he wrote, his mind engaged in that particular kind of reflection that came from reviewing a day's work and finding in it lessons that extended beyond the immediate circumstances. The rain had been gentle because autumn rains often were. The garden had weathered it well because the plants had been prepared by months of careful tending. The snails had emerged because that was what snails did in wet conditions. And his response to all of these natural phenomena had been to observe, to respond with care, to work with nature rather than against it. This philosophy, this approach to gardening and to life more broadly, had not come to him all at once. It had developed gradually over the decades, refined through countless days of observation and experimentation. When he had been younger, he had tried to force outcomes, had worked with urgency and intensity, had believed that determination alone could shape the plants into whatever form he desired. But age and experience had taught him something different. The plants themselves possessed a kind of wisdom, a knowledge of what they needed and how to grow. His role was not to force them into conformity, but to understand what they required and to provide it as best he could. The entry completed, Aldwin set down his pen and closed the record book. His deep contentment, that foundational peace that had become the bedrock of his existence, settled around him as he sat by the fire. Outside, the wind had picked up again slightly, moving through the bare branches of the apple tree, carrying with it the scent of the distant monastery and the sleeping village beyond. He rose from his chair and moved to the window, looking out into the darkness toward the monastery. The lights in the windows had begun to diminish as the monks settled into their cells for the night. Only a few candles still burned, in the library where Brother Cuthbert might still be reading, in the infirmary where the elder monks sometimes spent their nights in prayer for those who were ill. The thought of the old monk brought to Aldwin's mind a question that had been hovering at the edges of his awareness for some time now. Brother Cuthbert was perhaps 10 years older than Aldwin himself, which meant the monk had lived a long life and might not have many years remaining. When the brother eventually passed, and eventually he would, as all men did, his knowledge, his years of prayer and study, his particular way of being in the world would all be lost to the living. This was not a sad thought exactly, though it carried within it an acknowledgement of loss. It was rather a thought that came naturally when one had lived long enough to watch generations of people arrive, live their lives, and depart. The world continued. The monastery would continue. The garden would continue. And eventually he himself would pass and someone else, if anyone, would tend to this plot of earth and these growing things. Aldwin turned away from the window and moved toward his bed. The fire was warm enough now that the cottage would remain comfortable through the night. His preparations for sleep were the same as they always were: the removal of his outer tunic, the settling of himself beneath his wool blanket, the positioning of his pillow beneath his weathered head. But before sleep came, he lay for a time in the darkness, his eyes open, his mind drifting in that peaceful, undirected way that came when the day's work was complete and the body was ready for rest. He thought about the plants in his garden, about the way they had responded to the rain, about the preparations that were drying in his workshop. He thought about the monks in their cells, settling into sleep or prayer or quiet contemplation. He thought about the village beyond the monastery, where ordinary people were living their ordinary lives, many of them unaware that he existed, but some of them, those who had come to him seeking remedies, knowing his name and his work. All of this was part of the fabric of existence, he thought. Each person, each plant, each animal, each natural process, all of it wove together into something complex and beautiful and utterly beyond any individual's complete understanding. His role in it was small, really. He tended a garden. He prepared remedies. He lived a quiet life in a small cottage. But that quiet life, that small work, that modest garden, they mattered. They contributed to the well-being of others. They were part of the greater pattern. With this thought settling peacefully in his mind, Aldwin closed his eyes and allowed sleep to begin its gradual approach. The sounds of the night, the wind, the distant creaking of the monastery buildings, the occasional call of a night bird, all of these seemed to form a kind of lullaby, a gentle accompaniment to the descent into sleep. In the days that followed, a rhythm established itself. Autumn deepened, the air grew colder. The light seemed to retreat earlier and earlier each day. Aldwin's work in the garden continued, though now it shifted more toward harvesting and preservation as the plants prepared for their winter dormancy. The chamomile had been completely dried and stored. The lavender flowers had been processed and sealed. New plants demanded attention, the final harvests of plants that would not survive the winter, the careful preparation of beds for those that would. The monastery community continued to bring him their ailments and their questions. An elder monk developed a persistent cough as the cold weather arrived, and Aldwin prepared a particular blend of herbs, coltsfoot and thyme and a touch of honey, that seemed to ease the discomfort. A younger novice came with joint pain from the work of copying manuscripts in the cold scriptorium, and Aldwin prepared a warming oil infused with herbs that brought relief. Each of these interactions reinforced what had become clear to him over the decades, that his work, though humble, was necessary. The remedies he prepared did not cure the fundamental conditions of human existence. Death would still come, age would still accumulate, illness would still arrive. But in the meantime, in the space between birth and death, his work eased suffering and brought comfort. And that was enough. That was more than enough. One afternoon, as autumn was giving way to the first hints of winter, the air had taken on that particular quality that meant frost would come soon. Brother Cuthbert arrived at his cottage door. The old monk was wrapped in his heaviest cloak, his breath visible as small clouds in the cold air. "I have come to see how you are preparing for the cold months," the brother said, his voice carrying that particular warmth that came from years of genuine friendship. "And to bring news from the monastery, if you care to hear it." Aldwin welcomed the monk inside, offering him a seat near the fire, preparing warm broth for him. As they sat together, Brother Cuthbert shared the news, which monks were ill, who had recently arrived at the monastery, who had departed for other communities. The old monk asked questions about the garden, about which plants had done well this year, about what Aldwin anticipated for the coming winter. "You have been tending this garden for how long now?" the brother asked at one point, his aged eyes reflecting the firelight. "Nearly 40 years, Aldwin replied, his weathered hands cradling his own bowl of broth. "Since I was a young man, really, just learning the work." "And in all those years," Brother Cuthbert continued, "has there been a day when you regretted this choice, when you wished you had chosen differently?" Aldwin considered the question carefully before answering. "No," he said finally, There have been days of difficulty, certainly. Days when the weather destroyed crops, when remedies failed, when people suffered in ways I could not ease. But regret? No. I have been fortunate in my life, brother. I have been allowed to do work that is meaningful, to live in a way that brings peace. The old monk smiled, and something in that smile suggested that this was the answer he had hoped to receive. "Good," he said. "Good. When I am gone, and the time cannot be far distant, I want to know that there is still someone here tending to such work. Someone who understands that a quiet life, lived well, is worth more than all the great works that might be accomplished in haste and turmoil." The winter arrived gently that year, without the harsh violence that sometimes marked the season's beginning. The first snows came in late November, soft flakes that fell slowly and melted almost as soon as they touched the warmer earth. But gradually, as the days shortened and the temperatures dropped lower with each passing week, the world began its transformation into the stark beauty of winter. Aldwin's garden entered a period of dormancy that was not death, but rather a kind of patient waiting. The plants that would survive the cold had withdrawn their energy down into their roots, storing it carefully against the time when spring would call them forth again. The plants that would not survive had completed their cycles and were being gradually composted back into the earth from which they had grown. Nothing was wasted in Aldwin's approach to gardening. Everything that had lived would contribute, in some form, to future growth. The work of winter was different from the work of other seasons. There was less to do in the garden itself. No harvesting, no careful tending of delicate new growth. Instead, the work shifted indoors to the continued processing of the plants that had been harvested and dried throughout the autumn. Aldwin spent his days in his cottage and drying room, grinding dried herbs into fine powders, mixing remedies according to recipes that had been refined over decades, preparing preparations that would be used throughout the winter months when fresh plants were unavailable. The cottage became even more of a sanctuary during the winter days. The fire burned almost constantly now, providing essential warmth against the cold that tried to seep in through every crack and gap in the stone walls. The scent of the herbs seemed to deepen and intensify in the cold air, creating an atmosphere that was almost tangible in its medicinal richness. Visitors from the monastery came more frequently now, seeking remedies for the coughs and joint pains and general malaise that came with the season's chill. One particularly cold afternoon, when ice had formed on the edges of the well, and the path to the monastery was slippery with frozen rain, Brother Cuthbert arrived at Aldwin's cottage looking more frail than usual. The old monk's breath came in slightly ragged gasps, and his aged face had taken on a grayish pallor that spoke of discomfort. "I am growing old," the brother said without preamble, settling himself near the fire with obvious relief at the warmth. "The cold reaches deeper into me each year. I came seeking something that might ease the aching in my chest." Aldwin's observant nature took in every detail of the monk's condition: the slight tremor in his weathered hands, the way he held his breath occasionally as if checking on something, the particular quality of his breath when he inhaled. His weathered hands moved with purpose, retrieving specific jars and vessels from the shelves where he kept his preparations. "This is hawthorn berries," he said, showing the brother a vessel containing deep red-brown dried fruit, mixed with a touch of linden flower. It will help strengthen the heart and ease the strain of cold upon the chest. Prepare it as a tea, steep it in hot water for several minutes, then drink it slowly while it is still warm. Do this each morning and evening and the discomfort should ease. Brother Cuthbert received the preparation with a kind of reverence, understanding that what Aldwin was giving him came from decades of accumulated knowledge and careful observation. "You have been good to our community," the old monk said quietly. "More good than you might realize. There are monks in the infirmary who would not have survived their illnesses without your remedies. There are others who have lived years more comfortably because of your work. I am simply doing what I have been given the capacity to do," Aldwin replied, his deep contentment evident in his voice. "As you are doing what you have been given the capacity to do, we are all servants of something larger than ourselves, the garden, the community, the great pattern that moves through all things." The brother remained for another hour, and they sat together in the warmth of the fire, speaking little, simply existing in the companionable silence that comes from long friendship. When Brother Cuthbert finally rose to leave, Aldwin walked him to the door and watched as the old monk made his way carefully back toward the monastery, his form gradually becoming less distinct in the cold afternoon air until he disappeared entirely into the gray distance. The winter deepened. The monastery bells continued to mark the hours and the offices, their sound carrying across the cold air with particular clarity. Aldwin maintained his rhythms, the daily rebuilding of the fire, the careful tending of his preparations, the recording of observations in his record books. But now, in addition to the observations about plants and remedies, he found himself writing more frequently about the monastery community, about the people who came seeking help, about the ways that small acts of care seemed to ripple outward and affect the larger community. One morning in the deep cold of December, word came to Aldwin that Brother Cuthbert had passed peacefully in the night, his breathing simply ceasing as if he had decided it was time to stop, and had done so with the same quiet acceptance that he brought to all things. The news arrived via a young novice who came to the cottage to inform Aldwin and to ask if there was anything he might have been able to do to prevent the outcome. Aldwin received this information with the equanimity that came from having lived long enough to understand that death was not a failure, but rather a natural conclusion to the arc of a life well lived. Brother Cuthbert was old, he said gently to the distraught novice. He had lived many years, had done great work, had earned his rest. There is no sadness in this, though there is loss. The monastery will miss him, as will I, but he completed his journey as he lived it, with grace and acceptance. In the days following Brother Cuthbert's death, a kind of melancholy settled over the monastery. The funeral rites were observed with full ceremony, and Aldwin observed from a distance, standing at the edge of the monastery grounds, honoring the old monk's memory in his own way. After the service, several of the younger monks came to him seeking not remedies, but simply conversation, wanting to speak with someone who had known Brother Cuthbert well and might help them make sense of the loss. These conversations became a different kind of work than Aldwin had done before. He listened as the young monks spoke of their memories of the old brother, of his patience, his wisdom, his particular way of being present to others. And in listening, Aldwin found himself becoming a repository of memory, a keeper of the knowledge that Brother Cuthbert had carried, a connector between what was past and what would be future. After one such conversation with a young monk named Daniel, who had been particularly close to Brother Cuthbert, Aldwin made a decision that surprised even himself. As Daniel was preparing to leave the cottage, Aldwin called him back. "You have shown an interest in the work of plants and remedies," Aldwin said, his weathered hands gesturing toward the shelves of preparations that lined the cottage walls. "Brother Cuthbert once told me that when I was gone, he hoped there would still be someone here doing this work. I begin to wonder, would you be interested in learning? Not as a professional pursuit necessarily, but as a kind of avocation, something you might do alongside your monastic duties." The young monk's face transformed with something approaching wonder. "You would teach me?" he asked. "Truly?" "If you are willing to learn with patience and care," Aldwin replied. "This work cannot be rushed. It requires attention, observation, and a willingness to learn from both success and failure. But if you are willing to commit to it in that way, then yes, I would teach you. I am not young, and it would bring me peace to know that this knowledge would not be lost when I am gone." Thus began a new chapter in Aldwin's life. Winter provided a suitable time for teaching, as the outdoor work in the garden was minimal. 3 or 4 times each week, young Daniel would come to the cottage, and Aldwin would show him the work: how to identify plants from dried samples, how to understand which properties of each plant were most useful for which ailments, how to combine remedies in ways that strengthen their effects while minimizing any risks. The teaching was done largely without words. Aldwin would demonstrate a process, and Daniel would watch carefully, then attempt it himself under Aldwin's observant gaze. When mistakes were made, they were corrected gently, without criticism. When understanding began to dawn in the young monk's eyes, Aldwin would offer a slight smile of acknowledgement and proceed to the next lesson. Humming his plain chant melody seemed to please the young monk as well. Daniel began to hum along after the first few visits, and soon the two of them were creating a kind of simple harmony as they worked, Aldwin's deeper voice providing the foundation, Daniel's younger voice weaving around it in gentle counterpoint. The melody that had marked Aldwin's days for so many decades was being carried forward, would live on in the young monk's memory and voice, and would continue to mark the work long after Aldwin himself was gone. The winter continued its slow progression toward spring, but somehow it felt less isolating now. Aldwin still spent his evenings alone in his cottage, still maintaining his solitary practice of observation and preparation. But the knowledge that his work would be continued, that the understanding he had accumulated would not simply vanish when he passed, brought a kind of peace that went even deeper than his habitual contentment. One particularly cold evening in January, as snow was falling heavily outside, and the world seemed to have withdrawn into itself completely, Aldwin sat by his fire with his record book and began to write something different than his usual observations. He began to write an account of his philosophy, his approach to the work, the principles that had guided him through decades of tending plants and preparing remedies. "A gardener," he wrote in his careful script, "is not a master commanding obedience from the plants he tends. Rather, he is a listener, an observer, one who seeks to understand what each plant requires and works to provide it. The plants themselves possess a wisdom that exceeds human understanding. Our role is to work with this wisdom, not against it. Patience is not merely a virtue in this work, it is a necessity. The plants will teach us if we allow ourselves to be taught, if we are willing to slow our pace to match their rhythms. He continued writing through the evening, recording not just information about plants and remedies, but the deeper understandings that had developed over his years of practice. When he had finished, many pages had been filled with his careful handwriting, and the fire had burned down to coals. Aldwin set aside his pen and looked at what he had written. This would be useful, he thought. This would help Daniel understand not just the technical aspects of the work, but the philosophy that underlay it. This would be a kind of legacy, a way of passing on not just knowledge, but the understanding that made the knowledge meaningful. Outside, the snow continued to fall, covering the garden and the path and the distant monastery in a blanket of white. Inside, in the warmth of his cottage, surrounded by the accumulated preparations and knowledge of decades, Aldwin felt his deep contentment settle into something even more profound. He had begun the process of letting go, of passing what he had learned to someone who would carry it forward. The work would continue, the garden would continue, the remedies would continue to ease suffering and bring comfort. And though he himself would someday pass, as Brother Cuthbert had passed, as all living things eventually passed, he would not be forgotten in that forgetting. His work would live on in Daniel's hands, in the young monk's careful observations and preparations, in the monastery community that would continue to benefit from the knowledge he had transmitted. Winter released its grip gradually, the way winter does, without any sudden breaking of cold, but rather a slow, almost imperceptible warming that accumulated day by day until one morning, stepping outside, Aldwin realized that the air no longer burned when he breathed it in. The snow that had blanketed the garden through December and January had begun to retreat to shaded places, and the earth, rich with the decomposition of a season's worth of fallen leaves and snow melt, was beginning to show itself again. This was Aldwin's favorite season, that threshold between winter and spring when the world was poised on the edge of transformation, when the plants were gathering their energy for the burst of growth that would come, when the gardener's year began anew with all its possibilities and hopes intact. He stood in his garden one morning in early March, his weathered hands folded loosely in front of him, his silver-streaked auburn hair catching the pale sunlight, and felt the stirring of anticipation that had marked the beginning of spring for all the decades of his life. The work of spring began almost immediately. The beds that had been carefully prepared the previous autumn needed assessment now. Some of the hardy perennials, the sage, the thyme, the oregano, had survived the winter intact and were beginning to show signs of new growth. These needed to be carefully cleared of any dead material, needed to have their soil loosened and enriched, needed to be given the space and conditions to flourish once again. Daniel came to the cottage more frequently now, his visits no longer constrained by the cold that had made winter travel difficult. The young monk was developing into a capable student, his observant nature, or perhaps it was more accurate to say that he was learning to develop such observation, beginning to match Aldwin's own. He could now identify many of the dried plants by sight or scent alone, could understand the basic principles of combining remedies, could even prepare simple preparations under Aldwin's guidance. But more than the technical knowledge, Daniel was learning something else: the patience, the unhurried approach to work, the willingness to spend time simply observing and understanding before taking action. One afternoon, as they stood together in the garden assessing the spring condition of the beds, Aldwin found himself humming his plain chant melody, and Daniel joined in naturally, their voices creating that simple harmony that had become a familiar part of their work together. "How long have you been humming that melody?" Daniel asked when they had finished, his young voice carrying genuine curiosity. "Since I was younger than you are now," Aldwin replied. "Nearly 5 decades, I would say. It became part of my work so gradually that I can scarcely remember when I was not humming it. And now it seems to mark the rhythm of everything I do, the tending of plants, the preparing of remedies, even the simple act of moving through my day." "It is a beautiful melody," Daniel said. "There is something about it that seems to fit the work perfectly. It is neither rushed nor sluggish, but matches the pace at which things grow, the pace at which healing happens." Aldwin smiled at this observation. "You are beginning to understand," he said quietly. "Music and work are not separate things. They are expressions of the same understanding, that there is a right pace for things, a natural rhythm that should not be hurried or artificially slowed. When you find that rhythm, everything else follows." The spring work was demanding in a way that winter's work had not been. As the weather warmed and growth accelerated, the garden required constant attention. New plants needed to be started, either from seeds or from cuttings of mature plants that had survived the winter. The soil needed to be worked regularly, kept free of weeds that would otherwise compete with the herbs for nutrients and water. The irrigation system, a series of small channels that Aldwin had developed over decades, needed to be cleared and prepared to direct water where it was needed as the growing season advanced. But this demanding work brought with it a particular kind of joy. Aldwin's weathered hands, which had moved through the work of countless springs, moved now with a certainty and confidence that age had not diminished. His observant nature, carefully watching the first signs of new growth, could detect within days which plants were thriving and which ones showed signs of struggle. His deep contentment, which never wavered regardless of external circumstances, seemed to deepen even further as he watched the garden come alive with new growth. By late March, the beds were beginning to show the first real signs of spring growth. The seeds that Aldwin had planted in early spring, chamomile, feverfew, yarrow, and many others, were beginning to germinate, pushing through the rich soil in the form of tiny seedlings that would need careful tending to ensure their survival through the vulnerable early weeks of growth. Daniel arrived one morning to find Aldwin kneeling beside a particular bed, examining the new growth with his characteristic patience. The young monk knelt beside him, and together they observed the delicate progress of the seedlings. "They are so fragile," Daniel observed, his voice carrying a note of concern. "So small and vulnerable. How do you ensure that they survive? How do you protect them from harm?" "You cannot protect them completely," Aldwin replied, his gaze remaining fixed on the tiny plants. "Some will not survive regardless of what you do. Weather will damage them, insects will consume them, disease will strike some. This is the way of nature. The gardener's role is not to prevent all loss, but to create the best possible conditions for growth, to respond with care when problems arise, and to accept with equanimity those losses that cannot be prevented." This philosophy, stated not as an abstract principle, but as something demonstrated through the patient work of tending fragile plants, seemed to resonate deeply with the young monk. Daniel nodded slowly, his own observant nature beginning to understand what decades of observation had taught Aldwin. The weeks progressed, and the spring garden continued its miraculous transformation from dormancy to explosive growth. The herbs that Aldwin had devoted his life to cultivating erupted from the soil with an energy that was almost visible. The sage became a sturdy, flowering plant once more. The thyme spread across its bed in a fragrant carpet. The lavender began to send up its characteristic flower spikes. The chamomile, grown from seed, developed its delicate foliage and prepared to produce the flowers that would be harvested and dried for the autumn and winter ahead. In the monastery, news had begun to spread about Aldwin's willingness to teach Daniel the craft of herbalism. Several other young monks expressed interest in learning, and Aldwin found himself agreeing to work with them as well, though he limited the number to what he could reasonably teach without compromising the quality of instruction. By early summer, there were 3 young monks coming regularly to learn. Daniel, a quiet monk named Thomas who had a particular gift for understanding the medicinal properties of plants, and a younger novice named Oswin who was still uncertain whether he would eventually take full monastic vows, but whose curiosity about the work was genuine. Teaching changed Aldwin's relationship to his own work in subtle but profound ways. Where once he had worked primarily for the satisfaction of the work itself and for the benefit of the monastery community, he now worked also with an eye toward demonstrating principles and techniques to his students. This did not diminish the work. If anything, it deepened it, but it did shift his perspective slightly. He found himself explaining his decisions more frequently, articulating understandings that he had so long taken for granted that he rarely put them into words. One afternoon in June, as the herb garden was at the height of its early summer productivity, Aldwin gathered his 3 students and took them on a tour of the beds, speaking about the particular needs and characteristics of each plant type. "The chamomile," he said, gesturing toward the delicate flowers that were beginning to appear on the plants that had grown from seed in the spring, "is a plant of gentleness. It asks for modest conditions, not too rich soil, moderate water, good light. If you try to give it everything, try to fertilize it heavily and water it constantly, it will often become weak and susceptible to disease. It thrives on a kind of benign neglect, on being allowed to find its own balance." "But surely," Thomas said, his mind always engaged with the details of the work, "there must be a limit to this approach. Surely some cultivation is necessary." "Of course," Aldwin agreed, his weathered hands moving gently along a chamomile plant, checking its condition. "But the cultivation should match the nature of the plant. Heavy-handed intervention often does more harm than good. This is true of the plants, and I would say it is true of many things in life as well. Often, the best approach is to create good conditions and then step back, allowing things to develop according to their own nature. The summer progressed in waves of work and learning. The harvesting season, which had begun in late spring with the early crops, continued through the warmth of summer. Aldwin and his 3 students moved through the garden together, harvesting plants at their peak vitality, processing them for drying or for the creation of various remedies and preparations. The work was demanding, but it was also deeply satisfying, and the presence of the young monk seemed to energize Aldwin in ways he had not anticipated. Daniel, in particular, seemed to be developing a genuine calling to this work. Where some of the other young monks viewed herbalism as an interesting side activity, something to be done alongside their monastic duties, Daniel seemed to be finding in it something central to his understanding of what it meant to serve his community. He began to spend more time in the garden even when Aldwin had not specifically asked him to, tending plants, observing their conditions, asking questions about their care. One evening in late July, as the summer was at its height and the heat of the day was just beginning to release its grip, Daniel arrived at the cottage with a particular kind of hesitation in his manner. Aldwin, sitting in his chair near the window, watched the young monk approach with his observant nature, already sensing that something significant was about to be discussed. "I have been thinking about my future in the monastery," Daniel said without preamble, settling himself in the chair opposite Aldwin's. "About what my role should be, what my contribution should be to the community, and I believe I have come to an understanding." Aldwin said nothing, simply waited for the young monk to continue. This was part of the teaching as well, learning when to speak and when to remain silent, understanding that sometimes the most important communication came through presence and attention rather than through words. "I want to dedicate myself to this work," Daniel continued. "Not as a casual study, but as my primary focus within the monastery. I want to become the one who carries this knowledge forward, who continues what you have begun. I want to spend my life as you have spent yours, tending plants, preparing remedies, serving the community through this particular kind of care." Aldwin felt something shift within his chest at these words. Not surprise exactly, for he had sensed this development over the past months, but a kind of deep satisfaction, a completion of something that had begun when he first agreed to teach. "Then that is what you shall do," Aldwin said quietly. "The monastery will benefit and the knowledge will be preserved and continued. This is a good thing, Daniel, a very good thing." In the weeks that followed, arrangements were made. Daniel would eventually take over many of the responsibilities for the monastery's herbal work, though Aldwin made clear that he intended to continue working as long as he was able. But the transition had begun. The younger monk would learn not just the technical aspects of the work, but the deeper philosophy, the understanding that had taken decades to develop. As summer moved toward autumn, Aldwin found himself making observations about his own place in the larger pattern. He was 67 years old now, ancient by some measures, though his health remained generally good. He had lived nearly 70 years, had tended this garden for 47 of them, had helped countless people through his remedies and his knowledge. The deep contentment that had marked his emotional baseline for so many decades was still present, but now it was joined by something else, a sense of completion, a feeling that his life's work was being properly concluded and passed on. The autumn approached with its promises of harvest and preparation for winter. Aldwin stood in his garden one morning in late August, looking out over the beds that were heavy with late summer growth, and hummed his plainchant melody. Daniel was working in a nearby bed, harvesting chamomile flowers with the same careful attention that Aldwin had taught him. Thomas was preparing beds for the autumn crops. Young Oswin was carrying baskets of harvested herbs toward the drying room. The work continued. The garden continued, and though Aldwin knew that someday, perhaps soon, perhaps many years hence, he would pass from this work as Brother Cuthbert had passed, he felt no fear or sadness about it. He had tended his garden well. He had passed his knowledge to those who would carry it forward. He had lived a life that was meaningful and complete. The late afternoon light was beginning to take on that golden quality that meant the seasons were turning. Aldwin made his way slowly back toward his cottage, feeling the satisfaction of a day's work well done, feeling the peace that came from knowing that all was as it should be. The autumn of that year arrived with a gentleness that seemed to match the peacefulness that had settled over Aldwin's life. The harvesting continued in earnest through September and into October, and the rhythm of work that had been established over the summer deepened and became even more refined. The 3 young monks who studied with Aldwin had each begun to develop their own particular relationship to the work. Daniel with his deep commitment and increasing mastery, Thomas with his intellectual precision and careful documentation of methods, and young Oswin with his intuitive understanding of which plants needed what kinds of care. Aldwin found that teaching had become not an additional burden, but rather an enhancement of the work itself. As he demonstrated techniques and explained principles that he had once taken for granted, he discovered new layers of understanding in work that he had been doing for decades. The very act of articulating what he did and why he did it seemed to deepen his own comprehension of the interconnected nature of his craft. One afternoon in mid-October, as the first serious frost was predicted for the coming night, Aldwin gathered his 3 students in the garden for what he called a final harvest lesson. The chamomile flowers had come to their peak in late summer and were now beginning to fade as the plant prepared for its dormancy. This was the moment when the last of the flowers needed to be harvested, the moment when the plant needed to be left alone to complete its annual cycle. "You see," Aldwin said, his weathered hands moving gently along a chamomile plant, "the plant is telling us that its time of flowering is ending. The flowers are becoming fewer. The plant is beginning to direct its energy downward into the roots where it will rest through the winter. Our job is to read these signs correctly and respond with respect. We harvest what remains because it still has value, but we do not strip the plant bare or demand more than it is ready to give." Daniel knelt beside him, his young monk's robes rough against his skin, and nodded slowly as he observed the subtle changes in the plant that Aldwin was pointing out. "How do you learn to see these things?" he asked. "How do you develop the ability to read what a plant is saying?" "Through attention," Aldwin replied, his observant nature evident in the way his eyes moved across the plant, taking in every detail. Through spending time with the plants day after day, season after season, year after year, there is no shortcut to this knowledge. It cannot be learned from books alone, though books can help. It must be learned through the body, through the hands, through the experience of working with living things over a long period of time. As they worked through the afternoon, harvesting the last flowers, preparing the beds for the coming frost, Aldwin was aware of a kind of bittersweet quality to the moment. This work that had defined his life for so long was being successfully transferred to younger hands. His students were becoming truly capable, developing the depth of understanding that would allow them to continue this work long after he was gone. And yet, there was also a sense of loss in this transition, a recognition that the era of his own active practice, the decades when he had been the primary herbalist for the monastery community, was gradually drawing to a close. That evening, as the three young monks returned to the monastery, and Aldwin sat alone in his cottage, he found himself writing again in his record book. But this time, instead of recording observations about plants or remedies, he found himself writing about the nature of teaching and learning, about the way knowledge passed from one generation to the next, about the profound satisfaction that came from successfully transmitting understanding to those who would carry it forward. "When I was young," he wrote in his careful script, "I believed that my role was to become the most knowledgeable herbalist, to accumulate as much understanding as possible, and to guard it carefully so that my knowledge would be valuable and rare. But decades of experience have taught me a different truth. The greatest reward is not in holding knowledge closely, but in sharing it generously, in watching others develop their own understanding, in knowing that the work itself, more important than any individual practitioner, will continue after I am gone." The first hard frost came the night after that final harvest lesson, killing off the last of the tender annual plants that had not yet been harvested. In the morning, when Aldwin stepped outside, he found the world transformed by a delicate coating of ice that made every plant and blade of grass glisten in the pale autumn light. The sight was beautiful in its starkness, in its reminder that the garden's year was turning decisively toward dormancy. The work of autumn now shifted to final preparations. Beds were cleared of dead material and enriched with composted matter. Perennial plants were protected with layers of mulch. The drying room was organized, and the herbs that had been harvested throughout the spring and summer were carefully processed and stored. This was rhythmic work that required care but not the constant attention that spring and summer demanded. In early November, as the bare trees became more skeletal and the days grew noticeably shorter, Aldwin received a visit from the monastery's abbot. A significant visit, as the abbot rarely came to the cottage. The abbot was a man of perhaps 60 years, a scholar and administrator whose primary focus was on the intellectual and spiritual life of the monastery community. But he was also a practical man, and he came with a particular purpose. "Brother Daniel has informed me of his intention to dedicate himself primarily to the work of herbalism under your tutelage," the abbot said, settling himself in the chair near the fire. "And he has asked whether the monastery might support this in a more formal way, providing him with specific time for this work, releasing him from some of his other duties so that he might develop true mastery of the craft. Aldwin listened carefully, his weathered hands folded in his lap, his observant nature nodding the particular tone in which the abbot had spoken, the subtle indications of genuine support for the proposal. "I believe this would be wise," Aldwin replied carefully. "Brother Daniel shows genuine aptitude and commitment. Given proper time and focused attention, he could become a truly skilled practitioner, and the monastery would benefit from having someone with deep knowledge of herbalism available to serve the community's needs." "Then it is agreed," the abbot said, leaning back in his chair. "Brother Daniel will be given the time he needs for this apprenticeship. And I would also like to propose something else, that you, Master Aldwin, be formally recognized by the monastery community as our herbalist, with a regular stipend to support your work. You have served our people for decades with no formal recognition. It seems only proper that this should be acknowledged." Aldwin felt a moment of surprise at this proposal. Not unpleasant surprise, but genuine astonishment at the idea that his long years of quiet work might be formally recognized. He had never done the work for recognition or reward, had simply done it because it was the work that needed doing and that he was equipped to do. But he understood that the abbot was offering something more than material support. He was offering official validation that this work was valuable, that it was worthy of the community's intentional commitment. "I am honored," Aldwin said simply, "and I accept not for myself, but because it will help ensure that this knowledge continues to be valued and properly transmitted to future generations." This formal recognition changed little in the practical details of Aldwin's life. He continued to work in his garden and cottage in much the same way he always had, but something subtle shifted in how the monastery community related to his work. The young monks who came to study with him now had the explicit support of the abbot. The remedies that Aldwin prepared were now officially part of the monastery's care for its people. And most importantly, there was now a clear succession plan. Daniel would eventually become the primary herbalist, trained and supported by Aldwin, ready to carry the work forward when Aldwin was no longer able to do so. The winter that followed was quieter than the previous winter had been, softer in its emotional quality. The physical work was similar, the same preparations, the same attention to the drying herbs, the same tending of the fire. But there was less sense of urgency, less feeling that Aldwin needed to record everything before it was lost, less anxiety about the future of the work. Daniel was learning rapidly, becoming capable in ways that suggested he would eventually be able to manage most of the work independently. On the winter solstice, that longest, darkest night of the year, Aldwin invited Daniel, Thomas, and young Oswin to spend the evening at the cottage. He prepared a special meal, nothing elaborate but carefully made. A hearty broth with herbs from his stores, bread from the monastery bakery, cheese and dried apples, and hot spiced mead to warm them against the cold. As they sat together, the four of them gathered around the fire. Aldwin found himself humming his plainchant melody, and the three young monks joined in, their voices creating a harmony that seemed to resonate in the small space. The melody was the same as it had always been, but now it was being carried by 4 voices instead of one, and something in that transformation felt deeply significant. "This melody," Aldwin said when the humming had faded, "is perhaps the oldest thing I have to give you. I have been humming it for nearly 60 years, and before that I learned it from an older herbalist who taught me when I was even younger than you are now. It is not my melody. It belongs to no one person. It belongs to the work itself, to the rhythm of growth and care and attention that makes herbalism what it is." "Will you teach us the words?" Thomas asked. "I have been wondering if there are words to this melody." Aldwin smiled. "There are words," he said, "but they are words in Latin from an old plain chant tradition. They concern themselves with healing and with the particular grace that comes from attending to growing things. But truly, the melody is most important. The melody is the container that holds the meaning." And so, in the darkness of the solstice night, with the fire providing warmth and light, Aldwin taught the 3 young monks the words to the melody that had marked his life for so many decades. The words were simple, repetitive, meditative, perfect for accompanying work, perfect for marking the hours of a day spent in careful tending. As the evening progressed and the young monks eventually made their way back to the monastery, Aldwin felt his deep contentment settle into something even deeper, a kind of completion, a sense that his life's work had been properly honored and would be properly continued. The work would go on. The knowledge would be preserved. And though he himself would eventually pass from this world, as all living things passed, the understanding that he had accumulated and the care that had driven his life would continue to serve others long into the future. The new year came, and with it came the gradual reawakening of the cycle. The days began, almost imperceptibly, to lengthen. The frost that had gripped the earth through December began to loosen its hold, and in his cottage and garden, Aldwin continued his work with the same unhurried pace and complete attention that had characterized all his days. The final days of winter slipped gently toward spring, and Aldwin stood in his garden one morning in early March, his weathered hands folded loosely before him, his silver-streaked auburn hair catching the pale sunlight. The beds were beginning to show the first tender signs of new growth, the hardy perennials pushing through the soft earth, the seeds he had planted weeks before beginning their slow emergence. He hummed his plain chant melody as he stood there, the same melody that had marked every day of his life for 60 years, the same melody that now lived in the voices of 3 young monks who would carry it forward long after he was gone. The melody seemed to match the rhythm of the garden itself, the slow, patient unfolding of life from dormancy, the gentle progression of the seasons that had become the heartbeat of his existence. Daniel was working in a nearby bed, his young hands already developing the calluses that came from a lifetime of this work, his observant nature already learning to read the subtle signs that told him what each plant needed. Thomas was preparing tools in the shed, organizing everything with the precise care that seemed to come naturally to him. Young Oswin was gathering baskets for the spring harvests that would soon begin. The work would continue. The monastery community would be served. The knowledge that Aldwin had accumulated over 4 decades would be preserved and passed to new generations. And though the seasons would turn and turn again, though the years would accumulate and eventually carry him toward the same peaceful conclusion that had claimed Brother Cuthbert. He could rest in the certainty that what he had devoted his life to building would endure. He breathed deeply, feeling the cool air fill his lungs, feeling the faint warmth of the spring sun on his weathered face. Everything was as it should be. The garden was ready. The students were ready. And he himself was ready to continue this gentle work for however many seasons remained to him, tending these plants, preparing these remedies, moving through his days with the same unhurried pace and complete attention that had become the foundation of his peace. The monastery bells rang across the morning air, marking the hour, calling the monks to their duties. And in his garden, surrounded by the growing things he had devoted his life to nurturing, Aldwin returned to his work, his hands moving with the practiced grace of decades, his heart filled with the deep foundational contentment that no circumstance could ever diminish. The work continued. Life continued. And in the quiet beauty of that continuation, there was everything a person could ever need.